Okay. Well, that'll be that. So starting now, our session is recorded and it will be available to everyone that registered afterwards. It will be emailed out to all of you. So if there's something you'd like to return to or share with a friend, you'll be able to do so. Additionally, we do have some resources available on the Roots to Harvest website. And if anything's mentioned tonight, we'll add those to those resources. So those will be available to you about your food, your gardening, and your farming. And we plan to do questions at the end generally, but as you have those questions, feel free to use the chat box. And to access the chat, if you're new to Zoom, go ahead and move your mouse around on the screen. And when you do that, you should see a bar appear at the bottom, and there will be an option for chat. And when you click on that, a window will open to the right, and that's where you can add your questions. And you can do those at any point throughout the evening. We'll add those questions, and then we will take them at the end. So feel free to keep thinking along those lines. Marcel and Brendan do have the questions that you asked in the registration itself, so some of those might be addressed as we go along. But at this point, I think that's all I really wanted to say. We'll keep you muted for now, just so that Marcel and Brendan are at the top of your screen. And my final note is that, again, if you move your mouse around, you'll see in the top right corner something that says speaker view or gallery view. And when you click on that, you'll see that what you see on your screen changes. So you can play with those options until you see what you'd like to see. All right, so Marcel and Brendan, thanks for being here. I will turn my video and mute myself. If you want to introduce yourselves, I'll turn it over to you.
Great.
Great, it looks like we're unmuted. Is that the case?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Why don't you do the intros?
Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're happy to do a follow-up webinar here this evening now that the gardening season is underway. So probably a lot of you know Marcel and myself. We own Sleepy G Farm out in Pass Lake, and we raise certified organic vegetables and some beef cows and some layer hens, but vegetables is our main thing, and so we'll focus mostly on that tonight. So we have all of your questions that were submitted ahead of time, and we will do our best to address each one. We're going to talk about 6 different topics tonight. First, weeding, then mulching, then fertilizing, then pruning, then succession planting, and finally pest control. And that's a lot of stuff to squeeze in. So we're going to spend about 5 minutes on each, and then leave lots of time for questions towards the end.
Right on. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen. Just give me a second here to open up the photo. Because I'm so good at this. Okay.
We can see it loading, Marcel, but it's not quite up fully yet.
That's okay. Brendan can talk. Well, so I'll introduce what we're going to see here. It's a picture of Megan, and she's weeding the field. And you can see in the, maybe not yet, but hopefully you'll see in the field, in the soil, that there doesn't appear to be a lot of weeds amongst the lettuce that she's weeding. But what she has in her hand is a long piece of twitch grass. Which above the soil doesn't look like much, just a simple blade of grass, but underneath is a big long rhizome that's about, I don't know, 10 inches long, several different nodes of grass. So that's what we've got demonstrated here.
And this is one of the biggest weeds that most of us face. But just to take a step back, so what are weeds and why do we want to work at managing them? Weeds are just simply any plant that is not wanted. So an unwanted plant in an unwanted location. The reason we don't want weeds is because they compete for the other plants for water and nutrients primarily. And secondarily, they create a crowding effect, which can lead to disease issues, particularly towards the end of the season when fungus and other kind of fungal diseases start to set in. So June and July are, during those 2 months, our main preoccupation on the farm is killing weeds. And for home gardeners, we definitely encourage you to spend this time of the season killing weeds any way you can. The reward of doing so is that you're going to have a bigger yield of healthier plants. And then secondarily, you'll have less weed problems going forward in the future. Can you go to weed stages? Okay, so the next slide here.
Now I just want to stop. Rachel, can you see the photo? Did you see the photo of Megan anyway?
Yep, we saw the photo of Megan, and now we can see what looks like a graph that says rules of thumb.
Perfect, thanks.
Great, okay, so without getting too technical, see if I can explain this in about 1 minute. So for weeds to germinate, there are three conditions that need to be met. They need to have adequate moisture, adequate soil temperature, and that varies from weed to weed or even vegetable crop to vegetable crop. And finally, soil will ultimately dictate whether or not it germinates and comes to life. So if you look on the far left side of this diagram, you see what's called white filaments, or sometimes called thread. And if you dig through the soil in the top inch or so, you've probably seen those little white threads. And those are weed seeds that are just starting to germinate. And a couple of days later, they're in the cotyledon stage, which is the seed leaf stage. It's just emerging from the soil and starting to photosynthesize. Pretty soon it gets into the two-leaf stage, which is, it shows its true leaves, and you can identify the weed. And then it goes on to 4, 6, and more leaf. And finally, if left uncontrolled,
danger zone,
it will do what we all want to do, which is reproduce and spread its babies all around the field or the garden.
That's a weird thing to say.
which will come back in future years to haunt you. Rule of thumb is that any weed that is let go to seed, you will be seeing those weeds or the offspring of that one plant for about 7 to 10 years. So you can see why that would be something you want to stop. Okay, so in terms of our strategies towards getting the weeds under control, I want to draw your attention to the dark green part of the graph. And this shows where the weeds are most easily controlled and most effective by whatever means you're using. So it's pretty clear to see that once it's gone past the two-leaf stage, it's difficult to really get a grip on them, particularly on the farm on our scale, but on the home garden scale, it's very easy to go away to camp for the weekend when your weeds are at two-leaf stage and come back, and next thing you know, you've really got a lot of problems. So in terms of killing weeds, there are a number of different hoes that you can use. I'm sure that many of you have some of these hoes. We don't like to use very often what's known as the Dutch hoe, which is kind of the sideways bent shovel. Instead, we use these kind of razor type hoes that are generically known as collinear hoes. And what they do is they basically just glide under the surface of soil about 1/2 inch, and they just just sever that weed when it's at the thread stage or the cotyledon stage. And it very quickly dries out in the sun, especially on a day like today. Now, another thing to know about weeds is that all
Marcel and Brendan, do you want to hit pause for just a second? Okay, you're back.
Oh, dude.
Awesome. No worries.
No, you know what happened? My phone started ringing.
No problem. If you want to just share your screen again, we were in the hose section, and you were talking about collinear hose.
Great. Okay. So So,
Thanks.
so the point I want to make about the selection of hose is that we always work under the assumption that our garden of weed seeds, and anytime that we move the soil, whether it's with a hoe or a fork or a rake or even our hands, we're basically stirring up those weed seeds, which are generally invisible to the eye, and we're bringing them closer to the surface of the soil where they will germinate. So the depth of the soil, as I said earlier, will determine whether or not the weed seed germinates. If it's too far down in the soil, it knows better than to germinate. And so every time we move soil, we're bringing new weed seeds towards the surface and creating problems when temperature and moisture are correct. That said, the selection of hose that we're showing here tend to work the soil just about a ½ inch or an inch beneath the surface. And so we're really not disturbing the weed seeds and bringing further weed seeds up. And so that's a real key towards controlling your weeds. Disturbing the soil as little as possible. Now, in terms of, if you think back to the graph we had just shown, the best time to weed is when you can just see little green dots on the surface of the soil. They're very easy to kill at that stage with any of these tools. And it's actually very easy work. It's very meditative, and it's really not much of a chore. Okay, I think, I guess just to summarize, or just one final point, for us on the farm, weeds represent the single biggest obstacle towards economic viability on the farm, and our ability to control weeds, profitability. Now, that may not be the case on the garden scale and at home, but certainly you want to have success in your gardens, and you want to see the plants that you sow get as big and healthy as they can be. So I would really encourage you to focus on killing weeds from now until it's time to harvest.
And looking at the questions that came ahead of time and in the chat, it doesn't look like there's any questions about weeding. So I think we'll move on. We just wanted to cover the basics on when you should weed and what to use.
The final thing I'll say about weeding is that if the only weeding you do is to just go through, we call it weed hunting, and we go and get those big weeds that snuck by us and just pull them out before they flower and set seed. And if that's all you do, then that'll be worthwhile as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about mulching, and mulching is actually a good segue because one of the key reasons people will use mulch in their garden is to suppress weeds. It basically suppresses weeds and it retains moisture. Those are the two primary functions of mulch.
Oh, I can see some weeds in this photo. There.
Yeah.
There.
So there's many different photos showing some straw mulch, but people, wood shavings, even weed-free potting mix or compost. There are many different things. Plastic can be used. Newspaper. There's many things, and all mulches will help to control your moisture loss, and it will suppress weeds to varying degrees of success. Something to consider about mulches is that they also have an effect on the temperature of soil. And so, for example, mulch is a very common mulch that people are using, as well as black landscape fabric. Both are excellent at suppressing weeds and retaining. But a side effect of both of those products is that the soil temperature because of the color. And that is desirable for certain crops, but it would be undesirable for others. And so, that'd be great for things like tomatoes and peppers and squash that like that extra heat, but it would be detrimental for things like cabbages and even lettuces and some of the cooler season crops.
There's a question here. Does mulching with straw, as demonstrated in the photo here, I'm just adding that part because this is Swiss chard that we have with straw mulch. I'll just add that you don't need to have a cover over your mulch. We just happen to have both things going on here right now. The question is, does mulching with straw actually deplete the soil of nitrogen when the straw breaks down, or is it very surface level?
Okay, so the question is regarding the anytime you add, I guess you could think about it this way. If you had a really big meal, and so, Thanksgiving is always a good example where you stuff yourself full, and then, right after supper, you're feeling sluggish and slow, and because your body's working very hard to digest that food. Consequence of that, you don't have a lot of energy to do anything else. The similar thing happens in the soil when we have this to get broken down. It will tie up some nitrogen the following season or later that. And so what you can do to mitigate that is in the following year in that space, plant a crop that isn't so nitrogen, have as great of nitrogen requirements. Crops like carrots and beets would be a good choice for that crop. Add fertilizer in the following year, a more easily digestible fertilizer for the subsequent crop, whether that's a liquid fertilizer or another fertilizer. We'll talk about that in our
But
next
to answer
point.
the question, the mulch actually isn't breaking down in any real substantial way
In the first season.
in this system that you see in the photo in the first season. Where the soil contacts the straw, there will be some decomposition, but really the straw actually remains quite dry for the most part. And without moisture, it contact with the soil in order to do that. So the answer is really no, that you're not going to have a big issue with nutrients being tied up in a situation like this.
Not in this year, but once you rototill it in or turn it in, the next year you might see a little bit of a lockup of nitrogen in the following year.
It would be a good idea to turn it in the fall, maybe before the garden goes to bed for the winter.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I have any other photos nothing more about mulching.
So just to put a couple more points on the mulching thing, in this region where moisture retention is not usually a big motivator for gardeners and farmers alike, the reason we mostly do it would be for weed suppression. And particularly if, if you spend a lot of time, if you don't have a lot of time to maintain your garden, you work Monday to Friday and perhaps on the weekends you like to go to camp or something like that, then using mulch in your garden is a good way to kind of do some of the work for you passively. Now, in this climate, the black mulches, these are usually synthetic mulches like, as I said, black plastic, landscape fabric. There is no question that they are extremely beneficial for crops that really like the heat. So if you want to grow watermelons or cantaloupe or cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, winter squash, zucchini, the difference between growing those on a black colored mulch and just on bare soil is going to be night and day. You will have a much better crop for those heat loving crops. Yeah. So
consider mulches. It's not too late to lay some type of mulches, but it might be a consideration for another year.
And then if your garden, if you're one of those gardeners who really loves crops like cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower, these are crops that really prefer cool soil. This would be an excellent choice to use a non-black, so straw or light colored mulch in those crops, and it'll actually have the reverse effect in that it'll keep the soil cool, and those crops will greatly appreciate that. So the color does matter when it comes to mulch. It has a very direct impact on the soil temperature.
So not too much more about mulching. There weren't any other questions about mulching, so we'll move on then to fertilizing and watering. I think that's an important part of fertilizing because
Okay.
Water is?
Water is the cheapest fertilizer going. And we like to say on the farm because if we have the ability to water, then you are really helping your plants access the nutrients that are in the soil. So first thing we got to say about fertilizing is that, and this is kind of a mantra for us on the farm, is that you can't get something for nothing. And it is unrealistic to expect that we would have good yields of vegetables year after year after year out
In.
So obviously we're organic farmers, so we don't use synthetic fertilizer, use organic fertilizers, but we use fertilizers nonetheless. We are definitely very focused on feeding the soil, which in turn, the soil biology feeds the crop. So this could be, this could be, try and summarize it by putting it this way. The synthetic fertilizers, and if you're inclined to use those, then they definitely work very well. Synthetic fertilizers dissolve, are water soluble, and they dissolve very easily, and the nutrients are available to your plants very quickly. And whereas the organic fertilizers tend to be kind of like the raw ingredients, so things like bone meal or blood meal or alfalfa pellets or even compost for that matter. These are organic ingredients that have nutrient value, but only after being processed by the mines, basically the link between the organic fertilizer and then the plant available food that would result. And you could probably read between the lines here with what I'm saying, available to your plants. And so from year to year, then that's a great strategy. Other fertilizer amendments, but it's not instant. And we see plants start to struggle. And the most common
what are the signs and symptoms?
Mostly yellowing of leaves. If you see leaves that are starting to yellow, particularly at the tips and not through the whole leaf, basically the plant is yellowing of plants is not always a nitrogen, or which is a key ingredient, nutrient. It's not the only thing that will cause that, but it is a common one. The other thing and the other symptom would be just lack of vigor. You see that your carrots just are not growing very fast, or you're growing very, very slowly. If you're experiencing that in your gardening season, it was very advisable to use a liquid fertilizer to give them a little bit of a boost. And so this picture here is of Sarah. It's a fish emulsion fertilizer. It's a certified organic product.
I have photos of that too.
We've got a photo.
I took this photo of Sarah doing this yesterday. She's fertilizing our garlic crop, which is the biggest crop we have on the farm right now in terms of like its maturity. When and how to grow garlic that we'll address toward the end. So she's fertilizing the garlic because the garlic's getting ready to grow a garlic scape, which is basically the garlic plant heading towards reproduction. So that's why we're fertilizing this crop and a couple of other crops yesterday.
Marcel and Brendan,
So
if I can,
giving them a little bit of a boost mid-season, what that's doing is, you know, you got to think about a lot of your plants in your garden at this point. I mean, it's just the middle of June right now. And so the size of the roots quickly helps them to increase the size of the roots.
A photograph of the back of the fertilizer that we use. Brendan, you want to speak to that a little bit?
So it's obviously it's up to you what type of fertilizers you use, whether liquid or solid, organic or synthetic. But all fertilizers or any products that are sold as fertilizers, in this case, this is a 251, and that speaks to the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or NPK. And it's always in that order. So the first number always says how much nitrogen, the second or middle number always indicates how much phosphorus, and finally the third number is potassium. And these numbers are expressed in something to know.
This is what the front looks like. And if anybody's wondering where you buy it, I'm not looking at the chat right now, but I will shortly. I buy it at William Dam Seeds, where we purchase many of our seeds that we use on the farm. They sell this product, which is why we order it in. They sell large and small jugs of it, and it's easily diluted. You can apply it with a backpack sprayer like we do. You can apply it with a watering can. You can apply it with a small sprayer that, you know, a mister, if you wanted to do it that way. You can apply it, you know, any way that you were watering. You can either apply it to the leaves or you can apply it to the soil.
So the final thing I want to say about fertilizers and deciphering the numbering. So again, in the bottom right of this jug, it says 251 down by the fish's tail.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
Okay, so nitrogen is the key nutrient required for leaf growth. So any crop that has lots of leaf matter, and it's going to require nitrogen for that. Nitrogen is obviously all plants need nitrogen for leaf growth and photosynthesis, but crops that are very leafy will tend to require more nitrogen. The middle number is the phosphorus, and phosphorus is the key nutrient for root development. And so this particular product, as you can see, it's a 251, which means that it's pretty heavy in the phosphorus department. And this is why we're using this product at this time of year, to help the plants build a strong and robust root system. And finally, the final number, which is your potassium, or K. Potassium basically is a nutrient that is required for flowering. So crops that have flowers like squash and tomatoes and beans and anything that flowers and then fruits will require potassium in adequate levels to do that. Potassium is also the nutrient required or needed for plant immune system. So if your plants, year after year, you're noticing your plants always succumb to disease or fungal issues or bacterial issues, then you could look at adding some potassium to your soil to help with their immune system.
Somebody asked in the pre-questions upon registration about fertilizing. What do we use for fertilizing? So we talked a little bit about that already. How often? And how does it differ for specific plants, i.e. tomatoes versus root vegetables?
Okay, so let's just work backwards. That's a great question. And I think I've already answered the last part of it. So if your crop is primarily a fruiting crop and a flowering fruiting crop, then the potassium is going to be a key ingredient. If it's a root crop like potatoes, carrots, beets, parsnips, then you're going to want phosphorus in good levels in your soil. And if it's a leafy crop, so lettuces and like things like Swiss chard, cabbage, which then nitrogen And that's really simplifying things, but it's definitely a place to kind of point you in the right direction.
But you want to have a balanced approach to fertilizing regardless.
Yeah.
In terms of how often, depending on what you're using, you could fertilize with a liquid nutrient like we have, probably up to every week. We don't do that because it's really not cost effective. We just apply, when things would need a boost, just through observation. I use it in the greenhouse, the nutrient, this fertilizer to fertilize the seedlings during the greenhouse season, and then just before they go out to the field, so they're going out with a fresh meal. You can also fertilize by side dressing. So, side dressing with a compost, with, any sort of like granulated product that you might get. And so you would want to follow any directions on the product that you would buy, because I don't use a lot of that type of stuff. So we would want to follow the directions on the package if it's something that you're buying. If you're side dressing with something like compost, I apologize if the video is a bit choppy. If you're fertilizing with something like compost, then you would probably want to do that maybe just once over the season, maybe sometime, around the beginning of July. It's a full season crop.
So a lot of you will be using compost. You probably are making compost, and there's lots of organic gardeners regard compost as the single best thing to add to your soil. Compost is a fertilizer of sorts. It's pretty low test. But where it really shines is compost is basically just chock full of microbiology. And so there's lots of little beings that you can't see. They're microscopic, and they live in your compost. And when we add compost to our soil, we are adding some fertilizer value. There's no question. But perhaps more importantly, we're inoculating that soil with a population of a diverse population of microbiology. Those little guys and gals go to work at the organic constituents in your soil that they can eat and digest and make into plant food. So if you are inclined to use organic fertilizers, like I earlier mentioned, blood meal, bone meal, alfalfa. There are many different types of organic soil amendments and fertilizers. These are best, most effective when there's adequate soil biology to break them down. And, the approach from the organic farming perspective is that we try and add lots of organic matter to our soil and put the raw ingredients. We put in rock dust and minerals into the soil, and then we try and keep the soil biology healthy and functioning. And they kind of eat and digest and convert those minerals and elements into plant available food, kind of as needed by the plants. So it's a bit of you play a little bit of the long game that way. And if you don't have time to play a long game, or your vegetables are really suffering in the short term, then that's where you might consider using a liquid fertilizer to give them a boost. Okay.
Did you want to talk about watering a little bit?
Right. So watering. So having the nutrients in your soil and plants rooted in that soil is no guarantee that plant is going to access those nutrients. The key thing there is having adequate soil moisture. The moisture is kind of a conduit for the nutrients to travel to the plants and into the root system. So that's why we kind of tongue-in-cheek say, water is the cheapest fertilizer, because unless there's adequate soil moisture, there could be all the fertilizer in the world, but your plants can't access it. So in terms of watering, I think of watering in, there's kind of a very technical way that I describe our watering needs. The soil is either dry, it is damp, moist, or wet. Okay. And if it's dry, obviously there's almost no moisture. Damp is just, it's just you can feel the moisture in it, but it's not abundant. Moist is okay. there you can see the moisture. It's definitely there. And then there's wet, which is, squeezing and running out of your hand with a handful of soil. So we want to try and keep our plants kind of in the moist range. So damp to moist. There is obviously a danger of not watering enough. And we've all seen that when our plants wilt, and on a hot day, especially a windy day, if your plants are thirsty, certain plants will start to droop and look a little floppy until the sun sets and they'll perk up a bit. So if that's the case, your soil is definitely on the dry side. And then on the extreme end of the scale is wet. And a wet soil, the problem with a very, very wet soil is that the water displaces oxygen in the soil, and then all of a sudden it creates an anaerobic environment. And guess what? These little microbiologies, these little microscopic life forms, they're like you and I. They also need to breathe. And when the water is so abundant in the soil, it displaces the oxygen, they start to suffocate and die. So in terms of a watering regime on a weekly basis, if Mother Nature doesn't give us water, we're looking to see about 1 inch of water fall on the garden over the course of the week. So that said, if we get a bit of a rainstorm comes through and drops, 10 mils of rain, then sometime within the next, by the week's end, you should look at adding the equivalent of about 10 mils or 15 mils of water by whatever means you have. It is really important to keep germinating crops adequately moistened. The germination period, when you put seeds in the ground, they obviously need adequate soil moisture to bring that seed out of dormancy. They need soil temperature to be correct for them to decide to come alive. And if the germinating seeds dry out during that time, then they're likely to just wither and not amount to anything. So very important to keep your soil watered during the germination period. And while the young seedlings are kind of getting their feet under them and building a root system, it's important to keep them moist. But as they get a little bit older, it is important to back off on the watering a little bit, because if we as gardeners spoon feed the water to them and come home every evening from work and water our garden, we are not giving them any incentive to build a robust root system. And so they'll become quite dependent on us, and they'll have a very shallow root system. And a shallow root system doesn't have the same access to nutrients because it's not going as deep into the soil and gathering from a larger area. And the final thing I'll say about overwatering is that if we're constantly watering our vegetable garden, we are likely to run into fungal problems because damp and warm tends to equal fungal disease. So
not only that, but it is possible to overwater your crops. When the crops are sitting in standing water, they don't have access to oxygen. And I'm just going to leave that thought with that. So overwatering is a real thing.
Yeah, so there's a happy medium there.
So next I want to talk about pruning, especially in the context of tomatoes, because now's the time of year that your tomatoes are probably going wild. You know, they're in the leaf building stage. They're growing new branches probably all over the place. Tomatoes come in 2 types, and we had a question about this. I think it was pretty simple. Should you trim tomato plants? The answer to that is maybe. Depends what kind of tomato plants you have. Determinate tomato plants are also known as a bush variety. The bush variety of tomato has a predetermined, so you can use the word determinate to think about the predetermined size of the tomato plant. It's got a predetermined size that's likely not to get too big. Oftentimes, these tomatoes are the kind that you can just support with one of those cages that sticks into your pot or into the soil, and the branches can kind of just be supported, and the fruit branches can be supported by the cage. They don't require any pruning because they grow to a certain point, and then they'll flower and fruit, and you'll harvest the fruit, and then it's winter, which is pretty much how summer works around here. With indeterminate tomato plants, which are the kind that have an indeterminate lifespan, they will just keep growing and growing and growing and shooting off new arms and new branches, trying to replicate themselves, basically clone themselves over and over and over again to produce more and more fruit. These are the plants that you want to tame because they are very vigorous, and if you don't tame them back, you're not going to get the amount of fruit you want because it's spending all of its time building this epic network of arms and branches. So there's 3 types. There's basically 4 parts of the tomato plant that I want to talk about. There's the main stem. There's, and I'm going to show you a photo afterwards, but because of my poor internet connection here in Pass Lake, I'm going to explain it and then I'm going to put up the photo and we can take a look at it. And if anybody has questions, please put it in the chat. So it's got the main stem, and then it's got, we've got the leaf branch, which is basically just a leaf, and its job is to basically collect sunlight and photosynthesize. And then you'll see a sucker, which is the part that you'll trim. And in the photograph, I've got it labeled that you cut off the sucker. The sucker is basically the clone, the one that's trying to grow it, to become the leader. You know, the plant is, you get to choose who the leader is, and then the plant is constantly trying to develop a new leader. So you have to cut off those suckers. Then you'll see a flower cluster where the tomatoes actually grow from, the flowers that get pollinated. And then there's your main stem, which continues up. These plants most certainly need support because they are so big and vigorous, and you just get more bang for your buck if you're supporting the plant. And if it doesn't, like if it's unsupported, then it's likely to break or bend. Why don't I show the photo, and then we can just see if there's any questions that people have about tomato pruning. It's a key thing, and you know, if I didn't explain it well enough for you to do it, I'm sure there's a million YouTube videos that you could watch that would be like, prune here, cut here, because you don't want to mess up, you don't want to cut the wrong thing and then cut off all of your tomato flowers. So check out the video, I'll pull it up, or the photo.
It's loading. There, now we can see it.
So the leaf branch only has leaves on it. The sucker could have flowers on it. It could have leaves on it. It could have another sucker on it. It's a very vigorous plant and with its own mind. So that the red line is where you would chop that bad boy off. I'm going to just turn off the share because the audio is better without the share. So someone's asking me if you have determinate or indeterminate tomatoes. So when you purchase them, you likely got a little tag. If you bought them from me, the tag likely just said the name on it. And if you Google the name or even just ask me, I can tell you if it's indeterminate or determinate, but the tag at the nursery will say determinate or indeterminate. It's a known thing. If you know the variety, you can Google it and it'll tell you about the tomato. So if you know you've got Pink Lady tomatoes, you can Google Pink Lady tomato and you'll get a little write-up about what kind of tomato. Yeah, and then when you go into next season, if this is new news to you about the determinate, indeterminate type tomatoes, then you can sort of seek out what you're looking for. You know, if you're looking for a low maintenance tomato, then you'll probably want to get a determinate tomato. If you're looking for a tomato that's going to produce a lot and you want to string it up so it grows 7 feet high, then an indeterminate tomato is what you're looking for. Ruthie's asking me, should you cut the bottom branches off tomato plants? What if they are yellowing? Yeah, I always prune off the bottom branches if they're touching the ground. Not if the plant is only like 6 inches big, but if the plant is like 12 inches, a foot or bigger, once it's got a good leaf system, then yeah, I'll cut off the bottom branches, especially if they're yellowing or if they're touching the ground. If they're touching the ground, they have a likelihood of getting diseased because there's lots of pathogens in the soil and whatever. And so if you want to take those off, then you'll help prevent early and late blights on your tomato plants. If there's more questions about pruning, oh, there's a question about squash. Should we trim off the bottom branches of the squash? No, I wouldn't do that. No. I prune cucumbers, but only because they grow all over the place and I trellis them, but I don't trim any of the branches off the squash. If the branch is broken, I guess there's a few D's you can follow when it comes to pruning. Anything that's dead, damaged, diseased, there's probably a couple other D's. Those are reasons why you would want to cut the leaf off. Otherwise, the leaf is giving you, it's working for you. What it's doing is it's collecting the sun, it's photosynthesizing, and it's giving the plant energy to do its work. So unless there's a real reason to cut off the leaf, I would just leave it on.
So a reason a person would choose an indeterminate variety of tomato especially is that if you're limited in space, and growing vertically is always more efficient. You will actually get more yield of fruit per square foot of soil when you grow up with tomatoes. And similarly for cucumbers, if you trellis them. So that would be the reason to grow up as opposed to just a bush type or determinate type tomato.
I have another question here which kind of fits in with this. And this question is around pumpkins, and can you grow pumpkins vertically? Pumpkins will climb a trellis. The trouble is that when the pumpkin gets any sort of size on it, it will be too heavy, and there's a high likelihood of it, tearing down the trellis or falling off the trellis or breaking the plant right off. So, I see on the internet and I see in various places, people growing like watermelons or squash or stuff like that on a trellis, but they give the fruit support when it starts to develop. So like a netting or something, otherwise visualize like a bra for the squash or the melon or the pumpkin plant. Personally, we don't do any of that because it would just be way a lot of work, and it's just important. We just like to give the squash and the pumpkins a lot of space to spread out and do their thing, but it is possible. There's a question here about trellising. Will all types of cucumbers climb? From Billy. Hi. Are some varieties better? I plan on climbing Marketmore and Lisboa. So the answer to that is, yeah, they should all climb. We tend to help them find the trellis because we climb them up a trellis. You can also climb them up a string. We tend to help them find it, so we'll clip it on at least, the first couple of prunings or the first couple of trellisings. We'll clip them on with little greenhouse clips. You can also use twist ties. I don't recommend twisting the plants for cucumbers because they're so brittle. You're likely to just break off a piece or the whole thing. So clipping or tying is better, even with twine. Some varieties are intended for greenhouse growing, which is vertical growing. The Lisboa certainly is. The Marketmore is a field cucumber, but there's no reason why it wouldn't grow up a trellis or up a string. And
you will get straighter cucumbers when they get the gravity assist there.
Yeah, that's the truth. Sometimes your cucumbers come out kind of curled or like banana shaped. So they tend to, because of gravity, they tend to be a lot nicer and straighter. This year we're doing a trial on our farm with pickling cucumbers on a trellis in a little tunnel. I'll let you know how it turns out. That's everything about trellising and for pruning for the moment, but we can come back to it if people are interested. Let's talk about succession planting. What does it mean?
So succession planting means planting the same thing more than once throughout the gardening season. And, Thunder Bay is actually not as poor a place to grow vegetables as most people think. We have we generally can rely on about 90 to 100 frost-free days. And so if you look at most of your vegetables, that's usually enough time for them to mature. And then there's years where we may have 120 frost-free days. But either way, succession planting or planting the same thing more than once throughout the season is a great thing to do for a couple of reasons. One, it spreads out the work, so you're not having to work really hard at getting the entire garden planted at one time. You can kind of do it in stages. Two, it gives you a bit of an insurance policy. So if you know, say my first planting of carrots was kind of a bit of a bummer, don't worry, the second planting will come through, or even the third or fourth planting. And then I think the real incentive, well, I guess there's two other reasons. One, in Northwestern Ontario, we seem to not really have a season known as spring. It's winter and it's cold and there's snow on the ground. And then there's like a few days, a lot of times, and then all of a sudden it's like 25 degrees and we just kind of skipped spring. And so having plants growing, say in a greenhouse or in your house or some other location in trays that can go out into your garden when the time is right, helps to kind of mitigate the vagaries of especially our spring weather. And then finally, by planting successions of things, you actually get to use the same piece of garden, the same square foot of garden space more than once in the same gardening season. And one of the most successful succession planting crops, or crops for succession planting, I think is lettuce heads specifically. So imagine you've got some—
Or mixed lettuce, like baby lettuce, cut lettuce.
Something like, lettuce is, a crop that grows in about 40 to 60 days. So you could have lettuce heads growing in your garden right now in the middle of June. And in 2 weeks from now, you could be harvesting it and eating lettuce. But right now you could have little baby lettuces growing perhaps in your house or in a sunny location. And so as soon as the full mature lettuce heads come out of the garden, you can transplant these little ones back in to the same spot. And so you're kind of, we call that double cropping, gives you an opportunity to kind of get a big bang for your buck there.
Other crops that are good as succession plants, and somebody asked this question, so I'll just address it now. They asked if kale, lettuce, spinach, and peas will work as succession plantings. Yes, but you want to look at your days to maturity and your timing. So, the leafy stuff, you can plant pretty well all season. The peas, you don't want to wait too long because the peas have a longer life cycle, not because they're a long crop, but because they've got to grow to a certain size and then they have to flower and then the fruit needs to be produced. So there's a couple of steps with the peas, but lots of things that aren't full season crops could be succession planted. People even succession plant stuff like cucumbers because the plants tend to taper off and die back. So having another planting of cucumbers simultaneously that's a little bit behind will help you have cucumbers the whole season round if you're finding you're having trouble with them.
So many of you will know that carrots is our #1 crop on the farm. And once we start having carrots harvested out of the field, then we want to keep harvesting uninterrupted week after week after week after week until the snow sets in. And in order for that to happen, we plant carrots usually 3 times, sometimes even 4 throughout the season. So, our first planting would be June 10th. As late as June 10th. Because the soil is usually too cold before that, and carrots will not germinate if the soil is too cold. So June 10th, June 24th, and then July 15th, and then usually one more planting August 1st. And
that seems late to me, but
depending on the variety, if you have a short season carrot, then you could get it in August 1st or the last week of July. And if you had so doing it that way, even though that's a full season crop, they really take, you really can't put anything else into a carrot bed at the end of the season because it takes a long time. But by planting it several times, you're going to always have that vegetable kind of freshly harvested.
So that said, here on our farm, we have right now about maybe 50% of our land planted. And that might be surprising to some folks because you think, oh, you're a farm, you should get all your stuff planted and get it growing. But in fact, we actually want to have some stuff growing and then, some stuff that's going to come on a little bit later, and some stuff that's going to come on a little bit later, so that we can be harvesting all through the months of August, September, October. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Succession planting, very easy to do with some crops, and I would encourage you to try growing things indoors or in trays and then setting them out into your garden as other things are done. And you'll find that even if you have a small garden space, you can really maximize your yield that way.
Yeah. There's a question here about how to thin out plants and is it needed? And I want to address that one because it's really important right about now, or even for the next month or so, you would be thinning your crops, I think. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so very thinning is probably one of the number one pitfalls for novice gardeners, is that they don't do it because you plant the seeds, they all germinate, it looks green and great. But then you don't have the heart to go in and kill many of the little sprouts that are growing. But if you don't, there will be a competition problem, not unlike that you would experience in a very weedy garden, and the crop itself will become a weed to its neighbor. So again, carrots is probably a prime example. When you plant carrot seed, they're very small. You end up with once they germinate, you tend to have a thick line of green. And if you don't thin them, they will not get enough nutrients because there's too much competition. So the secret to getting, in that case, big carrots is to give them each adequate space. With the case of carrots, it's 1.5 inches between each little sprout, which
so
is...
just repeat yourself because the internet was acting up.
Sorry, in the case of carrots, you need to thin to 1.5 inches between each little sprout, which is to say that you're going to go and wipe out and kill probably 90% of the little carrot seedlings that are, an inch tall. And that's the secret to getting that plant to have access to enough nutrients to realize its potential. On the back of each seed package, it will give you some guidelines about how much space between each plant, and then how much space between the next row of that plant. So it might say something like, plant radishes in rows 6 inches apart and thin to 1 inch. So that means you seed it, and then you go and wipe out all of the little sprouts that are outside of that parameter.
You have to have a stiff drink before you do it, because nobody likes to kill plants that they've successfully sprouted. But you got to do it. Spacing is key. And if you're not transplanting a crop, if you're literally putting the seeds in the ground, your spacing is not going to be any accurate.
Yeah. For those, there's probably some of you on the Zoom meeting here that have taken our gardening course, and we spent an entire evening in our 4-week course just talking about proper spacing of your plants, because again, it is the number one pitfall. Enthusiasm abounds in the spring, and too many seeds and too many plants are put into too small space, and they're not proper. The space needs or requirements are not observed.
Ruthie wants to know, how big should the plants be before you thin them? And my sense is, they can be as small as 1 inch with regard to carrots, because they spend a long time at that 1 inch high stage. With beets, I would let them get a little bit bigger.
So a good rule of thumb is, if you think back to that slide that we showed with the weeds, the very first, once it emerges, it's the little round leaves that you see, we call those seed leaves or cotyledons. Then the next set of leaves will be the true leaves, which means they'll have the shape that is characteristic of that particular plant. The second leaf stage is when it's got 2 sets of true leaves. So at that stage, it would be safe for sure to start thinning at the 2 leaf stage. The 1 or 2 leaf stage would be a good time to thin, but not before that.
Awesome.
There's a couple of questions here about pests, cucumber beetles, and somebody, Susan, who has holes in her bean leaves, and we'll address those. We're just going to talk briefly about pest control. I'm going to first talk about some of the pests that are out and about right now in people's gardens. So cutworms are a big one that I'm hearing from people. If you had beautiful plants either sprout or transplanted in, and then you come out and they seem to be sheared off or missing, or otherwise not there, likely it was a cutworm issue. Cutworms are caterpillars that live just under the surface of the soil, and they start off small and then they grow to be big, fat, oily caterpillars about 1.5 inches big. If they're disturbed, they tend to curl up into a half moon or into a little circle. I have a photo, but I'm not going to share it because it tends to mess up with the audio and everything. So perhaps if you're interested in identifying what you might have as cutworms, just Google cutworm and you'll see it. We have had serious outbreaks of cutworms here. Right now we only have a few, which is a good thing because they're really they're just really pervasive, and they can do a lot of damage. I know that people have been struggling with them in town. So if you have that, there's not really much more you can do than find them and crush them. What I do is if I see a freshly sheared plant, you can dig around the base of where the plant was, and you can usually find the caterpillar there, and then you kill it. That's, there's nothing better than that.
Diatomaceous earth.
Diatomaceous earth is one thing that you could add. It's the jury's out on whether or not it's effective. It's a fine powder that comes from the sea, single cells organisms, diatoms, and you just spread the powder onto damp soil and let it sit on the surface. When the pest crawls across the diatomaceous earth, it becomes dried out, like it basically desiccates the insect. Another insect that people are seeing right now, and Susan, this is going to answer your question, are flea beetles. And if you look very closely, they're likely hopping around on the leaves of your plants. They particularly like the brassica family. So if your cabbage, broccoli, arugula, radishes are getting eaten by something, it will be flea beetles. Basically, they chew tiny little holes in the leaves until the plant either is full of leaves or dies, or full of holes or dies. So those are around right now because they really like the hot, dry weather. How do you stop them? You can't really stop them. You can put floating row cover over top of the rows to exclude them. But if you're going to do that, you're going to want to make sure there's none in there when you lay the row cover, and you're going to want to bury every single edge of it so they can't get in and under. They're really persistent, and they will come in and they will come under. So that's a consideration. Alternately, I would delay your planting. So if you're like, okay, my radishes and arugula got wrecked, leave it for now. Come back in 2 weeks, replant the radishes and arugula. There will be less flea beetles at that point. They fade into the season. So we're really hot and really dry right now. It's the early part of the season, but in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks even, you can seed again and there'll be less pressure. Plants can withstand a certain amount of flea beetle pressure. It's just when the infestation is really severe, then it will kill the plant. So even if you get some holes in it, and this might be the case with your beans, Susan, is likely the beans will be fine, unless you see them dying, and then I would seed again a bit later on. But as it is, they're probably going to be fine. They're going to be a little stunted, but
one strategy too, if you have a bit of a pest problem and the plants aren't dying, but they're stunted and kind of delayed, that would also be a good time to use some liquid fertilizer to give them the boost. In a lot of cases with these pests, one strategy is just to have the plant vigorously growing so that it's outpacing, it's growing faster than the insects can damage it. And so using a liquid fertilizer during this critical time is one strategy that would be effective. Mm-hmm. The other strategy, the reality is that insect pests tend to be more of a problem at this time of year than later in the season. Generally once you get into July, and certainly by the time mid-July rolls around, usually most of your pest problems are behind you, usually. And so that said, the late summer is a good time to grow those spring crops like radish, arugula,
turnips,
things that grow quickly. They only take 30 or 40 days to mature. So you do the count. If you put a 40-day crop in on, July 30th, you're going to be able to harvest that before,
In September.
Yeah. And so growing the quote unquote spring crops as a fall crop is a strategy that we've used on the farm for years. And we in fact grow, spinach is a good example. Spinach is a classic spring crop. We don't grow very much spinach at this time of year, but we grow a lot more of it towards the end of the summer.
Somebody had a question about cucumber beetles. I don't see a lot of cucumber beetles on our farm, but they do exist. I think that actually picking them is the only way to get rid of them, finding them and killing them. They're on the plants, stopping the cycle that way. Delaying planting, and I know it's probably too late this year, but delaying your planting a couple of weeks, just not planting like as soon as you can, but planting your cucumbers and squash like 2 or 3 weeks later than you normally would, might prevent the problem. Because most of these pests, like Brendan said, are really vigorous in the early part of the season, and then their hold kind of declines as the season progresses. So waiting could actually pay off. You think that you want to plant it as early as you can to get as much as you can, but sometimes it's the opposite. You wait a little bit, you wait for that threat to diminish, and plant your stuff a little bit later. Otherwise, you look for those spotted or striped cucumber beetles on the plants. Crush them, put them in a bucket, burn them, whatever you have to do.
Yeah, and just to reiterate Marcel's point about planting later, it's so counterintuitive, especially in Northwestern Ontario, to plant later than you feel like you should. Many people have it in their minds that, May long weekend or shortly thereafter is the time to put the garden in. And I very strongly disagree. I actually think, believe it or not, I actually think that the 20th of June, if you didn't start planting your garden till the 20th of June. So now, basically this coming week, this is a really prime time. And you would probably have more success planting now than had you started 3 or 4 weeks ago.
That's not to say you should wait, but waiting until June 1st would probably be a good strategy.
Absolutely, because what it comes down to is one of my earlier points with the weeding is that the soil temperature is everything, and if you put a plant into cold soil, you may get it in there successfully on the 25th of May or the 1st of June, but it's not going to do anything because it's so cold. If you just wait until conditions are better, you put the seedling in, the transplant, or you direct seed the crop, and it hits the ground running. There's no delays, there's no setbacks, and you get a healthier, more vigorous crop. So it's definitely not too late to really start get your gardens going this year. I would say that with the exception of a small handful of crops, planting as late as July 1st is not unreasonable. I've planted potatoes July 1st and had a good crop.
Not because we wanted to. Somebody asked a question about how and when to grow garlic, and I'm actually going to leave that question because Roots to Harvest is hosting additional webinars, and one of them is going to be sort of how to finish the season with your garden, and that's actually sort of the cliffhanger is planting garlic is planted in the fall, so that will be one of the fall crop or the fall actions.
So I think I know we're already over our time here, and no surprise, there's a pretty ambitious agenda, but I think we've answered all the questions that came in ahead of time. We've touched on all the 6 different topics that we wanted to, and
probably give you a lot to think about.
Yeah. So if there's questions about anything we said, or you need some clarification, then please type it in the chat bar now, and we can share with everyone.
And then Susan has commented that she put her garden in late last year and had a great crop, which, is great news. And, late is probably not too late.
For us on the farm, this is our 3rd year after 8 years of really trying to get things in as early as possible, and really, which worked sometimes. It worked some years, but more often than not, approximately 2/3 of the time, it didn't work. And then a few years ago, we decided to stop beating our heads against the wall, and we actually shifted our whole planting schedule about 3 weeks. So now we actually start about 3 weeks later than we used to, and it might be the smartest thing we've ever done. We just seem to have less problems at a difficult time of the year that's so unsettled.
Let's turn it over back to Rachel. who is our host, and maybe she has some closing things to say from Roots.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay on your end? Maybe.
Wherever is Rachel?
I'm trying to talk. Uh-oh. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you, Susan. Okay, so
maybe Rachel left us.
no, I'm here. Okay, so thank you for
Do you have
joining
anything
us.
more you want to say?
Yeah, thank you for joining us, everyone. We appreciate you coming to today's webinar. It has been recorded and will be sent out in an email to all of you sometime in the next
maybe not.
week.
Okay, well, we're going
have-
to stop our video, but we'll kind of hang around for a couple other seconds and keep an eye on the chat if there's any other questions. Thanks for coming to watch us talk.
See you guys.
Thanks, Marcel and Brendan. For anyone that can still hear me, I don't think they could hear me with their internet, and that's all right. The recording will be sent out. We will have future webinars, so please keep your ears tuned to Roots to Harvest social media and website for those announcements. One about putting your garden beds to sleep for the winter, which is what Marcel mentioned with the garlic. And also potentially putting food by. If there was another webinar idea you had, we'd be happy to hear those and know what you're interested in learning about. Otherwise, have a great night. Thank you for joining us and happy gardening. Bye-bye.